You're listening to Inside Air, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations.
Hi, I'm Flight Lt Chris Sully and welcome to the latest RAF Inside Air podcast. In this episode, we'll catch up with the commander of UK Space Command, Air Vice-Marshal Paul Godfrey, to see what's really going on behind the scenes and literally over our heads.
There is an element of, I don't know exactly what it's going to look like in 5 years, but that's a great thing, right? Because it means it's flexible in terms of how it grows. You know, you might not win a war solely with space, but I don't think you can win it without it. You know, so space will become incredibly important in the coming years. It is already. So yeah, ultimately, I'm proud of the team here for doing what they've done.
As usual, we'll also reheat a few stories which could have slipped under your radar, and we'll be finding out who's under the hat this week with AS1 Ben Russell.
What's the best thing about your job?
The opportunities to do sport, AT, force development, UK and abroad.
Inside Air, we're talking today about space and specifically UK Space Command with the Commander for UK Space Command, Air Vice-Marshal Paul Godfrey. Sir, welcome to Inside Air. When we talk about the space domain, what are we actually talking about? In other words, where does your team's work begin in terms of altitude and that kind of thing?
Hey Chris, great to be here. Yes, good question. We always joke in Space Command that we've got the biggest AOR, the area of operations. And actually, it goes from essentially 100 kilometers, 60 miles. I could say out to infinity. I won't, because that would be ridiculous. But certainly for the United Kingdom, I think at the moment it pretty much is out to the geostationary belt, which is 36,000 kilometers away from Earth, which is where our Skynet communications satellites currently reside. And it's understanding realistically what's going on in and around our own satellites. And we're going to be launching more over the next few years, but that's probably the size of it at the moment. And you can imagine 36,000 kilometers is 2.5 times the distance from where I am here in High Wycombe as I speak to you to Sydney. It's a long way to see. So it's a tough job.
Anyone currently serving or who has served will have heard the references to air and space. How does Space Command fit into the overall UK defence picture, and why do we even need a Space Command?
So definitely stop me if I'm going on too long on this particular one. I'll try. The short answer is 2019, NATO declared space an operational domain because of the threat systems ultimately that potential adversaries have got up there. Certainly Russia and China have got all sorts of capabilities. Maybe we'll talk more in a bit about those. But certainly NATO declaring space an operational domain was a wake-up call. And after that, through the integrated review, ultimately there was a decision to form a space command because as one of 5 operational domains, we didn't have a focal point. There were little areas of space across defence. So with the formation of Space Command, our focus now is to do a number of different things, but certainly one of those things is to protect and defend assets in and through space. And as I mentioned already, we already have 6 Skynet communication satellites that enable us to work as a global military. And given everything that other nations have got up there, it's certainly time to try and look after them.
You mentioned Skynet satellites. What are the UK's space capabilities as a nation? Are we playing catch-up at the moment, or are we pretty much where we'd hope to be at this stage?
I think most people outside Russia, China, and the USA are playing some level of catch-up. I mentioned it was only 2019, so it was, here we are in 2024 already. But 5 years ago, that most people realised that this was an operational domain. It's kind of crept up on us. Certainly the UK was actually the 3rd nation on Earth to launch dedicated military satellite communications satellites. The Skynet 1 was launched in 1969, which is a good thing because most people come to me and say, did we name it after the Terminator films? And it wasn't. It was well before the Terminator films, But it's interesting that Skynet is the all-seeing AI that invents Terminators in the movies. But certainly, here's an example. If you take my budget this year of 60 million, and we got $1.5 billion in over a 10-year period in the integrated review as we formed, which on top of £5.5 billion for future Skynet is actually, it's a lot of money. It's £7 billion over 10 years. It's almost $10 billion. But if you look at my US equivalent, General Saltzman in the US Space Force, his equivalent budget for this year, bear in mind mine was 60 million, his is 30 billion. So you can see there's a level of difference there. But ultimately, not only the UK, but a number of allied nations, and we can talk about the Combined Space Operations Forum. But we are looking to first do what we need to protect our own assets in space, and secondly, to add value to all the other partners and allies so that we can collectively protect and defend our assets and call out irresponsible space nations such as Russia and China. So whilst it appears we're playing catch up, I don't think it would have been worth us doing this previously. It is about the right time, which is why there are a number of different nations around the same time as us. France stood up a Space Command about a year before us. Just after us, Australia stood up a Space Command, Canada did, Germany did, so on and so on. So most of the other allied nations are now getting into this.
Just to take this right back to absolute basics, to boil it and distill this down into what the space platform offers us, what is it that we can do now that we couldn't do previously?
Well, so, one of the big things is education. Previously, no one would have been interested, I think, in an Inside Air podcast on space. And honestly, the reason I mention that is because fundamentally, people need to understand how critical space is to not only to defense, but to our way on Earth, the way that we live our lives in modern civilizations, primarily through the positioning, navigation, and timing signal, which we get in the West from the GPS constellation, the Global Positioning System constellation. There is a government report, the Blackett report, that was put out in 2018 that says it would the estimate back in 2018, so remember pre-pandemic, before we understood a lot of these things, was that the loss of that timing element of the position, navigation, and timing signal would possibly cause an impact of £1 billion a day, because when you consider that financial transactions are made through the use of that timing signal to ensure that everything happens at exactly the right time. Things like traffic lights, nuclear safety, all of these different things are linked to GPS and that timing signal. And so what can we do now that we didn't do previously? We can talk about an awful lot of this in the open. We can talk about an awful lot of the activity that we see in space. Some of this stuff was previously highly classified, but a joint collaborative organization that we put together with the US and a number of other allies now allows us to talk about the sort of threat systems that are out there. I could talk about the direct-to-sent anti-satellite missile that Russia launched in November of 2021, when we were only 6 months old at the time. So an interesting point where they launched from Earth and hit one of their satellites at about 500 kilometers in what we call low Earth orbit. An amazing shot when you think about it. That satellite's doing 17,500 miles an hour and the Earth's rotating as well, but creating a cloud of debris that is irresponsible space behavior. China, a satellite that they've got, SJ-21, in February of last year, rendezvoused with one of their inactive Beidou, which is their GPS equivalent satellites, and through a mechanism we don't quite yet understand, grabbed it and moved it a couple of thousand kilometers into what we call a graveyard orbit. A fantastic debris cleanup. Not so fantastic if they're using it against one of our Skynet satellites. There are other satellites out there that Russia have that are, potentially eavesdroppers, potentially signals intelligence, et cetera, et cetera. And so being able to talk about this in the open, makes people understand how important the space domain is, B, ultimately how fragile it is from a threat perspective and also a debris perspective, and C, allows us to let people know what we're doing and why we're doing it, and why hopefully we can enhance military operations for the other services as well.
Oh, we'll come back to that if that's okay, sir. But you can tell us a little bit more about the roles that actually make up UK Space Command. Who's there? What do they do?
Yeah, so we didn't start from scratch. I often make the joke that I feel like the CEO of a tech startup. But actually, there were 6 of us, I think 5 of them looking around the table at me on the 31st of March 3 years ago, the day before we stood up the command, wondering what we were going to do. Probably me as well, if I'm honest. But on the 1st of April, we inherited the RAF Fylingdales. So there's just over 300 whole force personnel up there, about 75 military, civil service and contractors that, the workforce, the heartbeat of that 24/7 capability. And Fylingdales is a radar that looks into space. It does 2 jobs, ballistic missile early warning and space domain awareness. We inherited the Space Operations Centre down here at High Wycombe, which kind of does what it says on the tin. There's 50 odd people in there, including UK Space Agency, and they analyse an awful lot of things. Again, we can probably come back to exactly what they do, but we inherited operations. And so ultimately what we do now is we have put a sort of command and control wrap around those operations. We are getting our sister domains to understand how we can help them. And then also, I mentioned that $1.5 billion, we are looking to develop new capability for the future. We'll be launching our first, I'm going to call it a ISR satellite, but Earth observation satellite. And that's an electro-optical satellite with a really good camera on it that will feed pictures to the defense personnel who do the processing of that sort of imagery. We're also developing more classified space control measures where hopefully it means we can do something about the potential threat satellites that I talked about, both on orbit and off orbit. So there's operations, there's a generation of capability, and then finally it's the training and education. And we are developing a space academy that's initial operating capability right now. Our preferred location for building the physical academy is down at Shrivenham. I'm off down there in a couple of weeks' time to go and shake some hands and take some photos. And we've already started and have developed the courses that we're going to put people through, from all the way from the foundational through to intermediate to advanced, and post-grad courses of people that will come through that space academy. So when it boils down to it, the short answer is operations, capability, and training and education.
So you mentioned UK Space Operations Centre, or UK SPOC as it's known, a very futuristic name. How does your work integrate with the rest of the Air Force and also with the other services?
Yeah, so just on that first part, it's interesting. The listeners won't be able to see the fact that I'm stood here in PCS uniform, and it was a deliberate choice from me because we're a joint command. So we are made up of about 70% Royal Air Force in terms of military personnel, 70% Air Force, 15% Navy, 15% Army. We've also got a considerable civil service workforce across. So we're a joint organisation, and ultimately we are doing space for defence, but we are not big enough to be our own, as they call it, top-level budget or our own service. There's no Royal Space Force yet. But certainly sitting under air has been just a way of brigading what we do. And there's an awful lot of air forces around the world that have taken sort of space under their wing, but we are doing space for defence. So if air has a space strategy, I'd also expect Navy and I'd expect Army to have a space strategy as well. So when you look at and we haven't talked about this yet, but at around the same time that we formed, a bit later that year, the National Space Strategy was announced, and in the February after that, February of 22, the Defence Space Strategy was announced as well. And in that defence space strategy, there were sort of three strategic themes. One was protect and defend. The second one was enhance military operations, and the third one is upskill and cohere. So pretty much the things I've talked about already. But in that enhancing military operations, I'd say that was primarily what we are doing for everyone else. And certainly the Space Operations Centre, as well as providing that the information to me as the commander ultimately as to what is going on in and around our Skynet spacecraft. And we're happy to talk about what we do when we get that information in a bit. But as well as that, they're also providing an awful lot of services to other people in defense. So for example, satellite overflight used to be a thing in a Cold War. Certainly it was when I joined, and I'm sure when you first put on the uniform, you'd have to understand when the satellite windows were to know whether you were going to pull out a piece of equipment into the open or put it back again. And that is happening more and more and more. I'm sure many listeners remember that balloon gate from the US, where there was that single balloon flying across the US and ultimately got shot down, and allegedly with a Chinese payload underneath. Well, at the same time, what they don't understand, there was over 300 overflights of Chinese satellites, observation satellites of the United Kingdom, but no one was talking about those. So getting our people to understand that is really important. The Carrier Strike Group and CSG-21, understanding that when you're in the middle of the Pacific, the chances are you still will be seen, from some of the capabilities that are out there. So solar weather is something that through a place called the MOSWAT, the Met Office Space Weather and Operations Cell, right now we're in a period of high solar activity that affects your communications. It can affect satellites. It can affect things on the ground as well. So understanding that, to know that when you deploy somewhere, you may or may not get SATCOM immediately is a big thing. Ballistic missile early warning is something that is done in the Space Operations Centre. And certainly February the 24th, 2 years ago, watching that initial salvo of missiles going into Ukraine was pretty sobering in terms of being able to see that from the various platforms that we've got in there. And so you can see an awful lot of, whilst the Space Operations Centre are there to ultimately give me the picture of what's going on and the other people that work in the UK Space Command, there's an awful lot of things that we do for other people so that they can understand, how they might want to conduct their daily business, or how they might even want to find GPS, for example. We can tell them, how strong, how good GPS signals are around the world, which is incredibly important if you are dependent on GPS weapons.
And you mentioned that we're in this particularly heavy period of solar activity, solar flares and things. There was a famous incident 100 years or so ago where national grid power lines were taken out and stuff. How susceptible, not just ours, but everybody's systems to that kind of thing in terms of what you can actually tell us?
Yeah, very. One I always use is it was one called the Carrington Event. I think there'll be historians online who are going to tell me it's different. Yeah, 1859. And certainly that caused all of the telegraph system in the northern United States to fail at that particular time. And I mean, that was a sort of 1 in a million type event, but it doesn't mean it couldn't happen again. And certainly that's what we're looking for, because a similar Carrington event, the effect on the magnetosphere, the effect on satellites in orbit, remember there were 0 satellites in orbit in 1859, but you can guarantee that almost none of those satellites are hardened against the effect of a significant solar weather event, and the effect that could happen down here on Earth as well, as far as power stations and electric currents being generated where they're not supposed to, computer systems. Ultimately, it could be catastrophic, which is why something of that level isn't ultimately handled by us. It's handled. There would be a COBRA, the Cabinet Office Briefing Room, pulled together for something on those sorts of lines. So it is incredibly important, and obviously, ultimately the sun governs everything down here on Earth. But again, it's another thing that people just don't understand the impact of solar weather, and that's why we're here, trying to get that out there, so they at least ask the question if they're about to deploy in operations or build a system that might be susceptible to changes when we get to periods of what they term solar max, to maximum activity out of the sun.
I guess if you think about it, if we spin the clock back, we've moved on so much incredibly in terms of technology, but we're still dependent on the weather. Broader sense now, it's solar weather as opposed to a storm passing through the Bay of Biscay, slowing down a Navy operation or whatever, but it's intrinsic. It's same thing. But presumably that will apply equally across the board. Everybody, adversaries and friendly forces will be suffering a similar thing.
Yeah, 100%. I think an event like that would be along the lines of the pandemic, in that there is such a massive effect on every country in the world. And again, it depends on, what side of the earth it hits, what time of day. There's so many variables that go into something like that of a large coronal mass ejection and having to be pointing directly at Earth, that, I think that would be when all nations of the world come together to try and mitigate the impact of that. But it's interesting you say, since the early days, I'm sure, of Vikings on raids coming across the North Sea and having to understand the weather to know whether they were going to get here, all the way through to
D-Day itself, obviously, and
there was a play in London, wasn't there, about the weather on D-Day and whether they actually went on that particular day. And there was a little bit of a gamble on there, and certainly 30 years of flying career for me, every single day started with a Met brief, a meteorological brief, a weather brief, to understand exactly what was going on. And weirdly, I was driving in early this morning and was listening to the shipping forecast and realised that I actually understand most of it when most people think it's gobbledygook. Yeah, so the fact that we're now talking about solar weather, I think is a good thing, because it's an awareness of how it does affect us down here on Earth.
You touched on this briefly, but the French have rebranded themselves to the L'Armée de l'Air et de l'Espace, excuse my pronunciation, but the French Air and Space Force. Are we eventually going to be looking at the Royal Air and Space Force, or is that off the cards?
I often get that question. I don't try and avoid it, but I don't know what path we're going to take in the end. Certainly, as in my third year now as the commander of UK Space Command, I see space as a domain in itself, and I would want Army and Navy, as I mentioned about strategies, I would want all domains to understand its importance. And I'd worry personally, the Air Force may well go down the Royal Air and Space Force in the future, but certainly I don't think, not for the next 5 or 10 years. I think it's worth sitting out and watching the rest of the world. But because I believe that it is a cross-defense function, personally, I would not want to tie it to one particular service. Now, we're tied in support terms, budgetary terms. We're intrinsically linked to air. I could not do what we do if we weren't sat under the umbrella of the Royal Air Force. But I think I think it's bigger than the Royal Air Force. But that's very much a personal view. Who knows what defence is going to do later on.
You mentioned that you're dressed in PC yesterday in greens. That was a conscious decision, as you said at the time. Will UK Spock eventually have its own uniform, or do you think it will continue to be this to reflect the tri-service and the interoperability side?
I tell you what, that's been a fascinating journey. Just from a leadership perspective, a culture perspective, when you start, I always talk about I'd rather be lucky than good, but to be in the right place, right time, to be able to stand up a brand new organisation, but that culture aspect really was something that I wanted to get right from the sort of, even the simple things that people don't think, what does your badge look like, your branding, how are we going to dress? And it was a personal, conscious decision to dress everyone in PCS, because I just felt, especially here at Air Command, a lot of people walking around in blues. I wanted some delineation to demonstrate that we were a joint organisation. Many people might have seen us around and about. Simple stuff like we've got a space stable belt on our uniform now. So whilst I can't, and there's always a good discussion about the United States Space Force, which I think is brilliant, and we're really close to some of the senior leaders and a lot of the operators across US Space Force. We can come back to this because the US space landscape can be a little bit confusing. They've got a US Space Force and a US Space Command, which are two completely different organizations. But obviously they stood up as an entire new service. So that uniform, in order to, again, for them, differentiate themselves from the other services, from the Air Force, the US Navy, US Marine Corps, and the US Army, was a big deal for them. And I love the fact that they've embraced a bit of science fiction past with the way that the uniforms look. And they've done that on purpose, you know? If you walk down the space corridor in the Pentagon, there's a massive nod to some of the science fiction past from, you know, whether it's books, whether it's films, movies, TV shows, and that's why they embraced the Netflix Space Force, you know, even though it was a sort of tongue-in-cheek series. So, you know, for us, it was just important to ensure that we were uniform, even though we're a joint organization. And we'll see where we go in the future. Again, you know, if a Royal Air and Space Force is sort of 10 years off, if it happened at all, a Royal Space Force is probably much longer. So I think we won't have to worry about the uniform until then. I'm happy to try anything, though. If anyone's got any good ideas, write in.
Watch this space.
Yeah.
You touched on this a little bit anyway, but what role will UK Space Operations Centre be taking when the new National Space Operations Centre comes into being later this year?
Yeah, so we're really excited about this. You know, there's a number of different things where we're told right at the beginning, there's a bunch of good ideas, right, let's go and do this. But certainly, and this is true in the space domain more than in any other domain that I've worked in. I worked really closely with the Navy in one of my previous jobs. Obviously, I've been flying around in aeroplanes, well, not obviously for the listeners, but, you know, I'm 33 years I've been in the Air Force now, and for most of that, I was flying around or in air-related jobs. And in this job, we deal with the civil space side of things. So the UK Space Agency, daily, I mentioned already, there's, you know, we have UK Space Agency personnel in our Space Operations Centre right now. It's a cross-government effort to look at space. So I sit on the National Space Board, and there's a member of every single government department on that National Space Board, and that goes up to a National Space Council that's chaired by the Secretaries of State of MOD and for DCIT, the Departments of Science, Innovation and Technology. And certainly, you know, I mentioned it with China, debris cleanup versus competitor removal. But, you know, in a much more responsible way, we want to create dual-use opportunities, because if we put up an Earth observation satellite that, yeah, can go and look at military targets around the world, it's doing 17,000 miles an hour, orbits the Earth between sort of 60 and 90 minutes. And therefore, why wouldn't you look at other stuff that other government departments might want to look at, you know, including car parking in Birmingham or wherever it happens to be. So we work really closely with our civil space colleagues. And certainly, actually, when we formed the command and I had our first, you know, within the first couple of weeks, our first away day to work out what our vision was going to be and these sorts of things, Paul Bate, who was the incoming CEO of the UK Space Agency, invited him along, and you know, and we worked really closely since. So, with the National Space Operations Centre, what this will be it will be a sort of development of our current Space Operations Centre, whether it's in the same place, whether we have different federated elements of it. But ultimately, I think we'll get to a point where the same as you have down at Swanwick is probably a close analogy of it, where you've got military and civilian air traffic controllers around. It's that sort of side of it within the Space Operations Centre, you know. So if we get to an element of space traffic control in the future, I'd see that as more of a civilian side. And certainly from a military side, we're looking at the sort of space defense like military would look at air defense. And so when we start this in April of this year, it is just a development of what we've got now, but then working together to create space domain awareness capabilities, new telescopes, new sensors, these sorts of things. And certainly, you know, bringing more and more personnel into it and upskilling people so that we've got that trained workforce. And I think just like the civil service in many of the military areas that a lot of us work, the sort of permanent staff, if you like, a military come in for 2 years or 3 years and then move out again. That's probably the way that I'd see the space agency staff within the National Space Operations Centre at the end. But it's fascinating. And there is an element of, I don't know exactly what it's going to look like in 5 years, but that's a great thing, right? Because it means it's flexible in terms of how it grows.
At an exciting time to be joining, which we'll come back to in a moment. You mentioned there about your background, fast jets, including the Harrier. You also spent time at the Battle of Britain Memorial flight with the Spitfires. How does your current role compare to that? Because it's vastly different, but it must offer some unique opportunities too.
Yeah, I have, conscious I've been giving you some really long answers so far. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I actually do a flying podcast as well, although I haven't done it for about a year.
Pilot episodes, yeah.
Yeah. You're always after sort of shorter answers on this one. But, yeah, I'm really lucky in terms of the career that I've had from, as you say, Harriers, F-16s with United States Air Force, 15, 16 years on Typhoon and in Battle of Britain Memorial flight as well. But I think more latterly in my career, certainly before I came into this job, I was the director of the Combined Aerospace Operations Centre in Al Udeid, out in Qatar, so responsible for the direction of air and space power ultimately across the Middle East. I think as a commander, the biggest thing you need to understand is command and control. And so from having been, just as a junior pilot, subject to command and control, whether it was the tactical command and control of AWACS as it was at the time, or ground control intercept officers on the ground, the GCIs, all the way through to the operational tasking of, right, when you're a more experienced four-ship leader or a weapons instructor, being able to look at an air tasking order, an ATO, and understand how your package fits into the broader big picture in terms of the way the war or that part of the war is running. And then going to the CAOC and being absolutely central to that command and control chain of everything that was happening across, a theatre across the Middle East, I think is probably the biggest lesson that I have brought into this, because it's fine having a radar that can see into space in Fylingdales. It's fine having a bunch of outstanding people in a space operations centre. Actually, I say a bunch of outstanding people, now number 1 Space Operations Squadron, and RAF Fylingdales is number 2 Space Warning Squadron. But it's great having that. You've got information, you need to know what to do with it, and that is where command and control comes in. So certainly in the third year of the command, as we've operationalised the command, it has been about setting that command and control, understanding who makes the decisions, who is involved in the decision making, and then who carries out the decision at the end of the day. That is the really important thing that I've learned over the years, that I think I brought to this. Again, another long answer. I said I'd try and make it short.
It's a good answer, and it's truthful. This would need to, looking at your team that come in, and obviously there's a variety of skill sets and a variety of jobs that people do, but what do they do during a working pattern? Is it sitting in front of the screen? Are there other elements? What do people do when they turn up for a shift?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, an absolute ton of different things is the answer. From I mentioned, kind of going north to south, but Fylingdales, I always laugh, I'd spent 30 years of a flying career trying to avoid it, because because of the power of the radar, there's a sort of big avoidance circle around it called a HIRTA, HIRTA, which is a high intensity radio transmission area. And a bit like the sun I mentioned causing electrical currents, if the whole radar beam of that thing pointed at your aeroplane when you're in a typhoon, sometimes it can create a current. And in the past, not for decades, but in the past, old aeroplanes flying through HIRTAs could cause things to fall off the aeroplane. So I'd always avoided it like the plague. There's a quite a big ring around it, and especially in a fast jet, you don't fly near it. So it was fantastic to actually go there for the first time in this job. I was fascinated because if you just consider, it is like a small town that sits on its own in the middle of North Yorkshire moors, standalone pretty much in a no-fail 24/7, 365 operation, where they're either looking for ballistic missiles being shot around the world, or they're looking into space. So I talked about the Russians shooting their own satellite. That one of the sensors around the world that was tracking and cataloging the breakup event and passing that information around allies and partners was RAF Fylingdale. So you can imagine in a shift system, you've got a number of operators in there, and within the operators, there is a crew that do certain things, from understanding the sort of bigger picture down to specifically what is the radar actually seeing and how you are reporting that across telephones, across computers, and so on. So to your original question, yeah, they're looking at screens, but they're doing entirely different jobs. And then within the radar, you've got the engineers and specialists keeping that radar itself running. That radar, it's outstanding, but it's 30 years old. So it leaves a lot of care and attention. I think it's a bit like Trigger's old broom out of only fools and horses, in terms of it's had 3 new heads and 4 new handles. So although it's a 30-year-old radar, I think most of the components are pretty new in there. And then you've got the care and feeding and the welfare and all of those sorts of things that you would see on an RAF station that we know. And that's just one element. Then you'd get to the Space Operations Center, and within the Space Operations Center, you've got orbital analysts. So they're receiving information from the sensors. They may be asked a specific question. Where is that rocket body going to re-enter? Is that a danger to any of the landmass on Earth? You've got orbital warfare individuals. What is that Russian satellite doing? Is it going to pass us with a big miss distance, or is it going to be really close? What are we doing at this particular point? So a load of analysis going on in that area. You've got people sat down there, again, 24/7, 365 as part of the Ballistic Missile Early Warning Network, ready to answer phones and provide that information to our people overseas. We've got intelligence in there. So, yeah, they're obviously looking at screens, but that is to understand the available intelligence out there and to analyze it and give me the information that I need to be able to do my job. And then you've got the headquarters that I'm stood in speaking to you now, which is primarily desk-based, as most headquarters are these days, but a raft of different things going on, from actually running the place and making sure the building works and that sort of stuff, all the way through to capability generation, as I say, building satellites and making sure that they're built correctly, or designing and building satellites, through to space operations and training and education. So it is a whole raft of different things. The only disappointing thing we haven't got at the moment is any astronauts, because I would love to be up there doing the practical side of things as I did in the cockpit for a number of years.
Excellent. So it's a little bit of jealousy on that one. In terms of, you started off with the combined cadet force going right back in your time. Somebody maybe in that situation now listening, or somebody else already serving in the RF and thinking, this sounds really fascinating. What sort of people are you looking for? Who do you want to come and be part of this, what sounds like a really exciting future?
It is exciting. Now, clearly I would say that, wouldn't I? I just did a little mini town hall with a load of the junior officers this morning, and yes, a few things that we need to do, just simple stuff like book desks on a daily basis to make people's life easier. But generally, there is a level of excitement because of what is happening in the space domain. Just some stats, and I will come back to the CCF, I promise you in a minute, we're going off on this tangent. But in the first ever satellite was Sputnik in 1957. By the year 2000, there were about 750 active satellites around the world. 2010, there's 1,000, so it's gone up by 250, a sort of slow increase. By the year 2000, there's 2,000. 2020, there's 2,000, so in 10 years it had doubled. As we sit here today, there's around about 8,500 satellites, right? So there's an exponential growth in what's going on, primarily down to one person, Elon Musk. And I'm about just towards the end of his biography at the moment, which is fascinating. But a couple of things. There's all of those satellites because he's launched Starlink, a broadband low Earth orbit constellation. Basically, you can go to John Lewis, buy a Starlink terminal right now for 75 quid a month. You've got about 100 megabits per second download into your house, probably faster than fiber in certain areas. But the reason he could put those satellites up is because he did SpaceX in the first place, a launch company which has got a fascinating story behind it, starting all the way back in 2004. But ultimately, he has brought the price of launch down from about $20,000 a kilo in what will soon be, in the next few years, $200 a kilo. So it now means so many people have access to space. So it's kind of a bit like, it was only 2007, I don't know, but you and me, that doesn't feel like a long time ago, but imagine how far we've come since the iPhone was launched, with apps and everything that allowed us to do. Well, it's kind of the same with Elon allowing us access to space, allowing more people, many more people access to space. Maybe we can come on to the sort of lessons from Ukraine that we've seen from space, but there's so many commercial space companies that you can request information from that have Earth observation satellites up there, that have, radar satellites up there, synthetic aperture radar. So it is mind-blowing, the sort of companies that are out there, the startup companies with some of the ideas that they've got. I'll come back to CCF. So for a youngster going through school or someone in the Air Training Corps right now, I just cannot imagine what the space domain is going to be like in 10 to 15 years. In 10 years when they're in the military, 15 years when they're sort of, even at the start of their career. Look at all of the spacecraft going to the moon right now, and with the Artemis missions, the US are going back to the moon, Russia and China are going back to the moon. Humans will be back on the moon, and if Elon gets it right, within 10 to 15 years, humans will be on Mars as well. This is what is so fascinating about it. So I think it is one of those things that when you ask, what sort of people are we after? We're just after interested people. You don't have to have a background in space. I'd say, 50%, if not more, of the people in Space Command have had to be trained up in Space Command, but I don't necessarily need someone to know about orbital mechanics or orbital warfare. We can train that into an individual. And I am really hopeful that in the coming sort of decades that we will start to get more, that we, the UK, will start to get more humans in space as space travel becomes more normalized. Ultimately, if you take the air domain, when was it, 1904, that Wilbert and Orville Wright first got airborne for a few meters over in Kitty Hawk in North Carolina. And then 10 years later, there are people flying aeroplanes around the Western Front. And then 30 years later, mass air travel is, we don't think twice about getting on an aeroplane. This is what is so exciting about the space domain. I have no idea what it is going to look like. So we're just after good people, interested people, and I think it is really easy to be interested in the space domain.
So somebody listening to this already serving has sparked an interest or picked up on something they already thought was interesting. What's their step? And also for somebody maybe still at school or going to university, what would their step be?
Yeah, so certainly with the cadets, we're looking to roll a couple of cadet qualifications, actually. We just started with the Air Training Corps. So RAF specific, again, because it's a good testing ground before we then get into the other service training corps, where you can get a space qualification. And I think that is the first thing to do, to understand, are you interested in it? Is this something that you think you could do as a career? After that, for people who are serving, I honestly, I have people coming up to me the whole time. It is get in touch, look someone up who works for Space Command on the sort of Internet Global Address list, and just get in touch with your career managers, because there will be slots available for people. We're not huge, as I mentioned. We've got about 560 personnel in the command now. Some of those are contractors, some of those are civil servants. But I think, if not everyone, 99% of them will be volunteers to do it. And so we need good people to come here. And there are other opportunities as well, exchange opportunities with the US down to Australia. So it is definitely a growth area, and having space on your CV is no bad thing at all, given that, you might not win a war solely with space, but I don't think you can win it without it. So space will become incredibly important in the coming years. It is already, but will become even more important.
You mentioned a few moments ago, as we come toward the end of this Inside Air podcast, lessons learned from Ukraine regarding the space domain. What have we learned? Presumably it's an ongoing process.
Yeah, so I mean, there's three things that I can talk about easily on this one. The first one is, I started talking about it already, the sort of Earth observation commercial ISI, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. When you look at how contested the air domain is there and the inability of either side to be able to fly reconnaissance aircraft over the top, they're using drones an awful lot of the time, but even drones are vulnerable, especially the larger ISR type drones. You can go to the highest ground there is, which is space. And although potentially contested in the future, and actually could be contested now given some of the threat systems that are up there, but the rise of, again, because of the low cost of launch and because of the increase in tech companies, commercial ISR has been unbelievable. And certainly when I'm out and about, I gave the High Command Staff College last week a brief they were visiting Lossiemouth. And I used some images from Maxar, which is just one of a number of commercial space ISR companies. Fascinating images that they've got ex-military people working for them. They'll do the sort of exploitation of the images. But I show one that they talk about all the time, which is a bunch of tents in the snow. This was pre-invasion in the end of January of 2 years ago. And some of those tents don't have snow on the top. And the explanation was because those tents are heated, which means there's people in those tents, which means that they're not just putting the tents up because they're doing an exercise, they are actually doing something here. So you can start to really gather intelligence and understand what's going on. There's a really unfortunate case study of Bucha, which was a town in eastern Ukraine that was overrun early on in the war by the Russians. And the Russians then ran this narrative that the Ukrainians had killed their own people and left them in the streets. There was all these bodies in the streets. But time-stamped satellite imagery matched with mobile phone footage clearly demonstrated that those bodies were not there until the Russians had gone into Bucha. And so, to be able to call out that false narrative is huge because you're always being looked at. So the ISR side, and I think, ultimately we'll see if it ever gets to the point where there's sort of war crimes trials and those sorts of things, there'll be a lot of satellite imagery for those sorts of things. Communications, I mentioned Elon Musk. There is no doubt that the use of Starlink terminals early on in the war, when much of the Ukrainian communications infrastructure had either been destroyed or cyber attacked, realistically saved Ukraine. And I stood there last week with a Ukrainian officer who actually gave a frontline view of what it was like pre-Starlink, and for Starlink to come in and reconnect them, it's night and day. You stood in the field wondering how you're going to connect to the rest of your battalion, and then all of a sudden this comes along and you can connect to headquarters and so on. So that low Earth orbit, Starlink, OneWeb Eutelsat is a British-French company that does the same thing, and actually the UK government has a stake in as well. Amazon Kuiper is about to launch the same sort of broadband satellites. I think this will revolutionize communications, and Ukraine has just demonstrated how quickly this has happened. It's caught a lot of people by surprise. Now, I think the final thing is our reliance on GPS, position, navigation, and timing, as I mentioned earlier, where it is, because those satellites sit 20,000 kilometers away, where there's a Russian GLONASS system, as I said, a China Beidou system, and there's a European Galileo system as well. But it's such a weak signal, it is really easy to jam. And if you look at all of the hotspots around the world, you can guarantee there is some level of GPS jamming. So if we are reliant on that for navigation across the battlefield, if we're reliant on it for precision through GPS-only weapons, we need to think again. We need some level of resilience to understand, how can we boost that signal? How can we have alternative methods of targeting? How do we have alternative methods using terrestrial timing or navigation as well? I think PNT, ISR, and communications are the three biggest things to come out of Ukraine. And definitely, we need to learn those lessons and build them into everything that we're doing across defence, actually across the sort of way we live our lives here on Earth as well.
And very much feeding into the information systems that go on and making sure we can counteract propaganda, etc. So you're about to move to a new role with Strategic Command at Northwood later this year. What do you feel proudest of that you and the team have achieved in your time with Space Command?
Yeah, it's an interesting. I could reel off so many different things here, but ultimately I'm proud of how the team has come together. It was really difficult at the beginning when, like I say, we're 550 odd strong, and I'm not joking when I say there were 6 of us sat around a table and wondering what we were going to do. And I had this kind of plan in my head that year 1 would be just putting ourselves together. Year 2 is developing the process. Year 3 is proper operationalizing the command. And we've got to that point, and we've come way beyond anything that I would have ever imagined. Sat there on the 31st of March thinking, right, I was just worried the Teams call was going to work the next morning when we did the initial formation of the command. And to be where we are now, with command and control of various things in place, with that, I said I'd come back briefly to the how we protect and defend the Skynet communication. So when I talked about the intelligence people, and people understanding what's going on in and around our satellites, is that when they believe that there is a potential threat to one of our satellites, I get fed the information. I make the decision on whether we put together a threat review board. When we pull together a threat review board, as we run through everything that we know, is there going to be a response in any way, shape or form? What are our response options, from doing nothing to picking up the phone, amazingly, to asking people what's going on, to sort of de-escalate the situation if it looks like it could be quite escalatory. Just simple things like that. I'd hoped we'd have got to this point, but to be at this point where we're really starting to mature these sorts of things, we've got people all around the world, we've created a ton of relationships. I'm just really proud of everyone for sort of pulling together, bearing with it in the early days when it was proper carnage as we stood up, and still bearing with it now when, we are still maturing. We're not quite there. We've had a changeover of personnel across the command as we get into our 3rd year. It's just been amazing. And it has been, you really see people pulling together based on that sort of common thread of space throughout everything. And it is because it is a hugely exciting domain. It is not a well understood domain. So people are really learning on a day-to-day basis. And I think all of that has come together to allow us to coalesce as a command and actually, get to the point where we're an operational command. So yeah, ultimately, I'm proud of the team here for doing what they've done.
I have to take you back just briefly. When you were first appointed, you made a famous tweet, now X, quote saying that you were binge watching the Netflix series Space Force to get yourself up to speed for this. Was it of any use at all?
Well, I tell you what, that tweet was quite a lot of use. I ended up in the I tell you what. So I'll give an absolutely 100% honest answer on this one. In that, I was quite active on Twitter, X as it is now. And I really enjoyed primarily retweeting comment, aviation-related comment, and so on. And as you said, was sort of pretty active with a podcast as well. I really enjoyed the conversations. I think what changed with that one particular tweet was it wasn't anything to do with the Space Force aspect, although I did find it funny. It was the reaction to that tweet, in that I think most military serving personnel took it in a way, a bit tongue-in-cheek. That's me being me, right? My sort of 3 top tips for life are: always be yourself, don't plan too far ahead, and do one thing every day that scares you. And that always being yourself, I thought, right, I'll send that tweet. That sounds pretty good. But it turns out that, especially as you get more senior, more and more people take notice of what you say, and there's always a conversation. I still see it going of senior commanders should do more, should be more open, and that's why I'm doing this. Chat to you guys and said, it'd be great to be able to get what we do across to the listenership. I think podcasts are awesome platforms just to have a conversation. But in this particular case, I ended up as a several scrolly page story in the Daily Mail online, which was actually a really good story. But the headline was, new space commander announced, says he's watching Netflix for tips. And you think, now, is that the sort of headline that I want to be associated with? And you know what? At the time, especially this being a busy job, I just thought, I kind of then half-heartedly tweeted after that, but realized that every time I said something, I thought, is this going to end up on the news? Do I have to think about every single word here? And honestly, I just found it a little bit. It was just easier to not tweet, and we've got an awesome engagement team here, and just let the professionals get on with it. But it's an interesting story that I'll tell anyone. The fact I'm telling you this and this is going out publicly probably means I'll end up in the Daily Mail again. But I guess it's a little bit of an insight into the conversations that we always have as senior commanders. In that, what are you putting out there in the public? What is best for the people that work with you, work for you? What works, what doesn't work, and certainly we live and learn from that. But having come off of Twitter at that point, there's definitely less arguing in my online forums. So
that's a good thing.
It was an interesting point that I think is worth sharing.
So just to wrap at the end, you are a pilot at heart. That's what you were doing at the end of a day's flight. There's nothing like the getting out of the aircraft and the sun setting in the distance over an airfield somewhere. That feeling. Do you get the same feeling now when you look out on a clear evening? Maybe you're sitting having a drink with the family, whatever, and looking into space and just thinking, wow, that's been some journey.
I tell you what, the funniest thing is that people asking me space questions and expecting me to know all about planets and those sorts of things. So if we are sat out there looking into the stars, people expect me to know everything now and what's going on. Is that a Starlink satellite? What's that one? You know what? It is a really interesting point. And you're right, there is a sort of aviator beer at the end of the day, job done kind of ethos. I think it's there in the space domain, it's an unexplored domain. I hesitated there because I wasn't going to say the final frontier.
Avoid that one, yeah.
Yeah, but it does, when you're sat there and you're looking up, and I think the interesting thing with the air domain was that I was there, I was in it. I was interacting with clouds. I was interacting with other aircraft in the domain. I was having to come back and land. But unless you're an astronaut on the International Space Station, or you're one of those lucky few who walked on the moon, or will be going to the moon in a few years, is quite intangible. So to look up and know, for example, the distances involved out there, what are we going to need to surveil the heavens? Are we going to get to a level of space traffic control? How is this going to work? Yeah, it is one of those things. If you get a moment to look up, and for me to know what's going on up there, but not be able to see it right now, it just makes you realize how far we've come already, but how far we've got to go in order to try and do everything that we need to in that domain. And also, probably a good way to finish, to try and operationalize our vision of making space safe, secure, and sustainable for all generations. Because the sustainability aspect, if we screw this up, low Earth orbit, whatever, then the generations after us aren't going to have access to space and everything that might bring them, from fast broadband from space to minerals mined on the moon to whatever it happens to be. So it's fascinating.
Air Vice-Marshal Paul Godfrey, Commander of UK Space Command at High Wycombe. Thanks for taking the time to talk to Inside Air today.
Hey, thanks very much, Chris. It's been an absolute pleasure. And as you said, if anyone wants to join Space Command, just get in touch.
This is Reheat for Inside Air. I'm AS1 Victoria Andrews. RAF Coningsby-based Typhoons from 11 Fighter Squadron have arrived in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to take part in this year's Spears of Victory exercise. Defensive counter-air and offensive counter-air operations, command and control, mission planning and integration training are part of the exercise programme, which sees contingents from Bahrain, Oman, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, France, Greece, Pakistan and the US operate alongside each other. The exercise aims to test the reactions of pilots in a variety of situations in a challenging air environment. Royal Air Force tactical communicators have joined their US Air Force counterparts in Germany to hone their skills using high-frequency communications. High frequency isn't a new technology, but when combined with modern technology, it offers an effective way to communicate globally without having to rely on satellites or data cables under the ground or sea. The training finished with a combined UK-US team establishing a high-frequency link with Guam, more than 11,500 kilometres away in the Western Pacific. The RAF has marked National Apprenticeship Week. The Air Force offers more than 20 different types of apprenticeships in a range of professions, from aviation operations to engineering and IT. And the Red Arrows, the Royal Air Force aerobatic team, have officially launched their Diamond Anniversary campaign. This includes the unveiling of special artwork, which will be seen on each of the team's distinctive Hawk jets. A new 9-aircraft show is part of plans for their milestone 60th season, featuring manoeuvres not seen for a generation in the Red Arrows display routine. The Red Arrows formed in 1964 and have completed almost 5,000 shows in 57 countries since then. That's Reheat on Inside Air.
Thanks, Vic. And now it's time to find out who's under the hat with Ben.
I'm AS1 Ben Russell, and this is Under the Hat, where we get to know an aviator in less than a minute. Name you're known by.
Sergeant Lee Abersmith, also known as Abers.
What's your profession?
I'm an information communication technician.
What's the best thing about your job?
The opportunities to do sport, AT, force development, UK and abroad.
Hardest part of your job?
Trying to get people to change to more new, efficient ways of working.
Best location you've served?
I really enjoyed being on top of a remote mountain, Mount Kent in the Falkland Islands.
What bit of luxury kit do you never deploy without?
I always deploy with my trainers. Love exploring new surroundings.
And what's your proudest moment in the RAF?
Representing the RAF, cross-country and athletics team at the inter-services against the best Army and Navy runners.
Thank you, Sergeant Lee Abersmith, for helping us sprint through another episode of Under the Hat.
That's all for this episode of Inside Air. Please give us a review, subscribe on your favourite podcast app, and join us again soon.
You've been listening to Inside Air, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations. If you're serving in the RAF and have a story for us, please speak to your unit media and communications officer. Inside Air is written and produced for the Royal Air Force by RAF Media Reserves.